At the end of the Patriotic War of 1812, and as our army entered enemy territory, certain elements of our military forces received new assignments and dispositions. My partisan detachment, as mentioned, was part of the vanguard of the foremost corps of the regular army. At first it appeared that this assignment was not much different from the one we had been given previously, and that it still offered sufficient ways and means for me to satisfy my restless yearning for brave exploits. But things turned out very differently. There were to be no more independent, intuitive, daring raids. Instead, there were calculated marches according to mapped-out guidelines, delivered to us by duty officers from Corps headquarters. We were now strictly forbidden to engage the enemy without special permission. The last raid I had conducted, prompted by youthful ardor and reckless courage, proved unhelpful to my foreign service record and, let's be frank about it, dimmed my future prospects, which suddenly became a source of fear and concern. The vanguard corps into which my partisan detachment was now incorporated consisted of 8,460 infantrymen, 3,109 regular cavalrymen, 3,535 Cossacks, and 69 battery pieces, plus some light and horse-drawn artillery with their attendants, and totaled altogether about 16,000 men. The corps was under the command of Lieutenant General and Adjutant Baron Winzingerode. The individual commanders were General Adjutant Prince Trubetskoy, Major Generals Nikitin and Bakhmetiev, Count Witt, Talizin, and Konoring, and the handsome and brilliant Lanskoy. Everyone knows in what pitiful state the remnants of that enormous Grand Army, which had overrun Russia, were now fleeing homewards. It is easy to imagine the insignificant resistance which the enemy put up against our main forces as they marched from the Niemen to the Elbe. The opposition we encountered was only from a few units. Our forces were divided into two streams. The first, under the direction of Count Wittgenstein, was marching through northern Prussia towards Berlin, preceded by 3 light detachments under Major Generals Chernyshев and Benkendorf, and Colonel Tettenborn, with full authority to act according to circumstances. The second, which comprised the main body of the principal army, and to which was attached the imperial headquarters, was marching through the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and Silesia towards Dresden. Ahead of it was the corps under Winzingerode, and 2 detachments, that of Lieutenant Colonel Prendel and mine, assigned to him. Both of these detachments were under the overall control of Winzingerode, who had forbidden them, or at least me, either to engage the enemy or to move from place to place without his knowledge, or that of the general who had jurisdiction over me. Around the middle of February, Russia concluded peace with Prussia, and the Prussian forces were moving to join us. The army under the command of Count Wittgenstein was reinforced by the corps commanded by General York and General Bülow. The corps under Marshal Blucher marched out of Breslau and now constituted the vanguard of the main army. Winzingerode's corps went to serve under his command and kept its place in the front line. On 20th February, Chernyshев seized Berlin. The enemy, after evacuating that city, moved in 2 columns towards the river Elbe, one towards Magdeburg, the other towards Wittenberg. The former was followed by Chernyshев, the latter by Benkendorf. At the end of February, Tettenborn was dispatched towards Hamburg, while Benkendorf and Chernyshев remained on the Elbe to keep Wittenberg and Magdeburg under observation. A special and independent detachment under the Tsar's adjutant, Guard Officer Orlov, was on its way to Grossenheim. The main headquarters of Count Wittgenstein was in Berlin, the imperial headquarters and the main headquarters of Prince Kutuzov, who was in command of the combined Allied forces, was in Kalisz. The Viceroy Eugene was at the head of a French army 60,000 strong, made up of the remains of the Grand Army and of various garrisons and reserves that had arrived from behind the Rhine. It was disposed as follows. Marshal Davout, with 17,000 men, was to defend the Elbe from Dresden to Torgau. Under his command was Reynier's 7th Corps, Gerard's 31st Division, the Bavarian Corps under Rechberg, and the Saxon troops of Lecoq and Liebenau. Wittenberg, Magdeburg, and the whole distance between them was defended by Grenier and Lauriston. There were 34,000 troops in their command, under the personal authority of the Viceroy Eugene. Marshal Victor commanded troops on the lower Elbe. His corps comprised no more than 6,000 men. The rest of the troops were stationed in Leipzig with the main headquarters of the Viceroy and the corps headquarters of Marshal Davout. Here, I must recount two circumstances that had a direct influence on my adventures. This period, when we were on the march from the Vistula to the Elbe, represented a brief spell of tinsel glory for our armed forces, although necessary in order to attract Germany to the common cause and gain the support of those who were still wavering. The French continued to flee. The myth of their invincibility was slowly dissipating. Some of their former allies were joining the victors, but others, shaken by the unexpected turn of events and still swayed by the genius and unbelievable resourcefulness of Napoleon, continued to hold back. We had to take advantage of our present successes before the arrival of new forces from France, and with our combined strengths, capture as much weakly defended territory as possible. This promised two important advantages: to extend the area available for future military operations in the event of Napoleon suddenly appearing from behind the Rhine, and to grip the imagination of those still unconvinced by the frequent pompous announcements of new provinces, cities, and capitals falling into our hands. What a rich harvest for those who basked in easily acquired fame. The leaders of the Allied armies took new heart and dreamed of triumphal entries into the capitals of Europe, with the city keys being cast at the feet of the emperor. Ranging from Blücher, not yet destined to bask in the glow of Katzbach, Brienne, and Waterloo, and who was thirsting for glory of any kind and at any price, down to each and every corps commander eager to feed his vanity with yet another captured city. Small towns, of course, were freely accessible, and these were left to feed the ambitions of small fry like us, the lower ranks of hungry would-be heroes. To my misfortune, there were only two decent-sized capitals available at that time. One of them had already been seized by Chernihiv, the other was Dresden, and in fact Blücher and Wintzingerode were both heading already for this fair city. They did not comprehend that the measure of any famous exploit is the amount of effort needed to accomplish it. The taking of Berlin by an entire army or a large corps would not have attracted general attention, whereas its capture by a light detachment justly brought fame to Chernihiv. I must add that after the crushing defeat of Napoleon's immense armies in Russia, no one expected the war to resume, and certainly not on the same scale as before. In any event, prevailing predictions tended toward peace, taking into account that hundreds of thousands of troops were converging on the Rhine, and with preparations to meet this onslaught still largely on paper. Given the prospect of early peace, the commanders of many armies that were already assembled seemed anxious for their names to be linked forever with the memory of the last shot that was fired and inscribed on the final page of this historic sequence of events. It was a noble aspiration, and my superiors were quite single-minded in this regard. That is why Blücher was seized with the desire to capture Dresden personally, and elbowed aside Wintzingerode towards Gerswerde. Wintzingerode, in turn, and for the same motive, pointed both Lanskoy and me in the direction of Meissen. Yet, for some reason, Wintzingerode was finding various pretexts to delay carrying out his orders and kept creeping slowly toward his goal. I could never understand this kind of behavior, and could not foresee that my superiors had been scheming in vain, nor that fate had singled me out to trick them and smash my own head in the process. Another circumstance concerns an army decree that had apparently been proclaimed within the borders of Russia, which forbade any kind of dealings with the enemy, and more particularly, any form of conditional agreement. It is possible that such a decree existed, but no such orders or directives ever reached our groups during the whole Russian campaign. Similarly, I was not informed for 2 months that I had been promoted to the rank of colonel or about my occupation of Grodno. As a result of my negotiations and the truce I concluded with the Austrian General Friedrich, I received a warm commendation from Field Marshal Prince Kutuzov and was awarded the Order of St. Vladimir Third Class by Emperor Alexander, who had then arrived in Vilna. These two circumstances, namely the desire of my superiors to capture Dresden themselves and the existence of an order forbidding negotiations with the enemy, turned out to be the hidden underwater rocks on which my corsair vessel, sailing ahead so bravely and carefree, was to founder. In the meantime, our troops were moving ahead. My party, as I mentioned before, was under the orders of Lanskoy, who commanded Wintzingerode's vanguard and remained to his right, heading for Muskau, Spremberg, and Horswerde. At the village of Bernsdorf, we caught up with the Tsar's adjutant Orlov. already set to march on Grossenhain. Orlov told me that he planned to cross the Elbe to threaten Dresden from the left bank. It must be noted that on that same day, 7th March, Blücher's corps was still located in Silesia, more than 3 days' march from Bunzlau. Wintzingerode's corps was on the way to Görlitz, and Lanskoi was entering Bautzen. In Bernsdorf, according to Lanskoi's orders, I detached squadron leader Czeczensky with the 1st Bug Cossack Regiment under his command to inspect the roads and neighboring area of Dresden, as well as to gather information on the city itself. Now let us have a look at what was going on in Dresden prior to my arrival in Bernsdorf and my junction with Czeczensky. For this purpose, I refer to the description of the Saxon general Odeleben, who wrote an eyewitness account. On the 12th of February, I left the capital for Plauen, which is in Westland, after turning over the government of the Kingdom of Saxony to a committee of government officials called the Immediate Commission. Half of the Royal Guard regiment followed the king, while the other crossed over to Königstein, where the government treasury and the famous paintings of the Dresden Gallery had been transported for safekeeping. The Hussars, part of the cuirassiers of the Guard, and the Zastrow regiment under General Libenow were quartered in both the old and the new city. On 23rd February, General Régnier, who had stopped briefly in Bautzen, entered Dresden with 7th Corps and quartered some of the men in the settlements on the left bank of the Elbe, with the others in the new city, in lieu of a vanguard. This corps did not number more than 5,000 men, taking into account the 1,400 Bavarian troops under General Rechberg, dispatched to Meissen, who had left the moment Régnier arrived in Dresden. The Saxon cavalry joined forces with him, and he was under strict orders to defend the Elbe crossings at Dresden and Meissen. For this reason, he transferred to the left bank all the boats that could be used by our troops to effect a crossing. He also set up mines around 2 of the supports of the magnificent bridge linking both halves of Dresden, moved hospitals and military supplies from the new to the old city, and erected several bastions and palisades around the new city. A commotion arose in the city. The people prevented the troops from mining the bridge for a while, but Régnier finally prevailed, and 2 bridge supports were ready to be detonated. In the meantime, on 28th February, Davout entered Meissen with his corps, 20,000 strong, set fire to a beautiful wooden bridge adjoining the city, and arrived in Dresden on 1st March. With his arrival, the preparations for the defense of the crossing went into high gear, but severity and oppression of all strata of the population increased to an incredible level. Régnier turned over the command of 7th Corps to General Derutte and left the city. The 7th and the following night were spent removing the artillery from the newly erected fortifications in the new city, and the transports and all sorts of heavy equipment were moved to the old city. On the 8th of March, at 9 o'clock in the morning, paying no attention to the written requests of the king and the entreaties of the inhabitants, Davout ordered the mines set off on the bridge, and 2 spans blew up into the air with a dreadful noise. That was the signal for him to march out to Meissen, leaving Derutte with 7th Corps and about 3,000 French soldiers reinforced by several battalions and squadrons of Saxons under General Lecoq. Derutte began to carry out his instructions. He set up 1 battery on the bridge at the break caused by the explosion to keep the length of the whole bridge under artillery fire, as well as the main street leading into the new city. Another battery was set up near the castle on the Wallergarten, and a 3rd one at Friedrichstadt, where he considered the most likely attempt on the left bank would be made due to a bend in the river that made a crossing easier. The defense of the new city fortification was entrusted to 2 companies of infantry, and ahead of them, the palisades were manned by Saxon sharpshooters. Major Eschke, commanding Saxon troops, was left in charge of that part of the city. This was the situation in Dresden when Czeczensky and the 1st Bug Regiment appeared with no more than 150 Cossacks. On the morning of the 8th, while on the march from Bernsdorf to Königsbruck, I heard a heavy roar coming from the direction of Dresden, and learned from the inhabitants of the neighboring villages, which lay in my path, that this noise must have come from the explosion of the Dresden Bridge, where French pioneers had been digging for some time and were only waiting for orders from Davout to blow it up. This accursed sound was to blame for all the unpleasant things that I had to endure later, It awoke my quest for honor, which had been stifled by the punctiliousness of Winzingerode. I quickly deduced that part of the city situated on the right bank of the Elbe had either been totally abandoned or merely contained a garrison, which my party could cope with, and therefore we could batter at the gates with a definite hope of success. I thought, if I can only gain entrance into the new city, everything will be accomplished. This will be the thin end of the wedge, and the glory of taking possession of the entire town will belong to me alone and nobody else. The only other people who could turn out to be involved would be Orloff, Prendel, or some Prussian company commander. It never entered my head that it might be Blücher or Winzingerode because they were so far from Dresden. My young blood was boiling, but obedience to superior rank gripped me by the collar. Being under the direct command of Lanskoi, with whom I was actually on friendly terms, I did not dare embark on this undertaking without his knowledge. A courier galloped over to him at Bautzen with this note, which I wrote word for word as follows. I am not so far from Dresden. Please let me have a try at it. Maybe success will crown my attempt. I am under your command. My glory is your glory. Because of the slow writing pace of Saxon postmen, I did not hear from Lanskoi for a good 7 hours. He wrote to me, I have long been seeking permission to send you on a partisan expedition, but met with refusal on the grounds that you might be needed here within 24 hours. I feel that these measures are too timid, so I authorize you to make an attempt on Dresden. Go with God. Lanskoi. Having received authorization, I immediately sent an invitation to Orloff to join the feast which I was planning, and in the event he was unable to come, I asked him for reinforcements, observing the French saying, God is on the side of the big battalions. After sending this message to Orloff, I marched out of Königsbruck at 4 in the afternoon. My party had hardly got underway when a Cossack brought me the following report from Czeczensky. Right up to the walls of the city, I could not find out anything from the inhabitants, except that there is no one in town, and that is why I galloped with 50 Cossacks to get a closer look. But as soon as I got to the gates, I was met by a violent crossfire from behind the palisades. Thank God, except for 3 horses, all went well. I have set up pickets and await your further orders. Squadron Leader Czeczensky, 8th March. I replied, hold tight, I am hurrying to join you with my group. Denis Davidov, 8th March, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Czeczensky now sent a second report. All day long, the enemy kept knocking down the pickets that I had set up around town. Fulfilling your Excellency's orders, I did not pull back one step, although I clearly saw that my persistence would not do any good. Suddenly, the mayor rode out with an appeal that the city be spared. I did not show any sign of surprise, but I could not begin to guess what this could mean. However, I told him that if during the night the residents would chase away the French troops occupying the new city to the other bank, the town would not suffer. Failing this, there would be no quarter given to anyone. The mayor asked for a 2-hour delay and went back to town. I shall remain with the regiment until his return to our day station, and as soon as a reply is received, I will report to you in full. On this day, during the exchange of fire, Ensign Romodanoi was mortally wounded. 4 Cossacks of the line were wounded and 9 horses killed. Squadron Leader Czeczensky, 8th March. In reply, I quickened my pace. My party was already about 3 miles away from Czeczensky on the hills covered by a pine forest from which the road descends to Dresden, when a new envoy sent by him arrived with this note. Our dear Denis Vasilievich, the town's mayor appeared and said that the commandant of the city wishes to speak with our officer. That's why Lowenstern went into town. The commandant told him that if we had the least bit of infantry, he would immediately evacuate the city, but he could not surrender it to Cossacks alone. Alexander Czeczensky. What could we do? Circumstances no longer appeared in the same light. We had to resort to cunning, which in such instances tends to be successful. I left 100 Cossacks at the place where I had received this last note from Czeczensky, with orders to set out bivouac fires along the hills in 4 places, and to light no fewer than 20 fires at each spot. Indeed, the more, the better, to make sure that they would not go out but burn as brightly as possible and remain clearly visible from town. In charge of this affair, I put the smartest of the Cossack officers, leaving him responsible for carrying out my instructions and allowing him to gather several local people from the nearest settlements to give him a hand. I hurried with my other 400 Cossacks and 50 Aktyrka hussars towards Chechensky, and we joined forces immediately. My first concern was to make good use of the surrounding area and deploy my forces to make the enemy believe that there were more of us than actually was the case. I set up bivouacs all along the outskirts of the city, facing the new town, posting the front ranks of my units in the open and concealing the rest behind the buildings. In that situation, I awaited full daylight, admiring the bivouac fires that my Cossacks had set up on the heights and burning as if they belonged to a detachment of 3,000 men. At that moment, I received a letter from Lanskoy, which hit me like a deadly bombshell. He wrote, "My dear Colonel, notwithstanding the permission I gave you, I find myself forced to change your direction as a result of orders which I have received from the corps commander. And so, my dear friend, instead of Dresden, I now ask you to leave Königsbruck and make for Radeberg, but do send horse patrols along all the roads leading to Dresden and clear all the neighboring areas. Deploy your troops to the right of Radeberg in the direction of Meissen and clear these nearby areas as thoroughly as possible. Give orders to requisition all the boats that are on this side of the Elbe and send patrols towards Torgau for this purpose. Arrange to erect a bridge at Pilsnitz, which you should hold until Maratov gets there. Maratov will station himself between you and the postal track which runs from Bischofswerda to Dresden so as to cover the movement of our corps, which is definitely moving away from the Kalisz road. Its headquarters are being moved to Guerswerda to clear the area for the Prussians. Benkendorf's Cossacks are in Torgau. Instruct your patrols to make contact with them. Independently of this, please issue orders to the local authorities to prepare as many food supplies and as much forage as possible for the corps, which undoubtedly will remain for some time on this side of the Elbe because of difficulties in crossing it. Asterisk, signed Lanskoy. I am writing to commence. I must confess that reading these lines came as a cruel blow, but I soon recovered my wits and decided nonetheless to continue my activities. My reasoning was as follows. What, I asked myself, does Lanskoy want to accomplish by sending me to Radeberg and Meissen? First, to collect boats and provisions for the supply of the corps. Second, to ensure that my party and Maratov's detachment protect and cover the movement of our corps from the Kalisz road to Gorswerde. But the preparation of food supplies is much more easily achieved through the city authorities, who have control over the local police of the area, and I would certainly be carrying out Lanskoy's directives more effectively by seizing the city rather than by turning off to Radeberg or Meissen. As for assembling boats, there are none to be had, since no enemy commander would leave them for the benefit of his opponents on the opposite shore. So it is pointless for me to worry about obtaining things that are unavailable to us and securely in the hands of the enemy. Then there is the question of cover for the movements of Winzingerode's corps. Wouldn't it make more sense, in order to carry out Lanskoy's wishes and those of the corps commander, for me to station my group at the point from which all enemy patrols spread out to track our troop movements, instead of scattering my party along the several main routes and risking neglecting the side roads and paths that the enemy scouts might take? Furthermore, is it not obvious from Lanskoy's expressed intentions that his new orders were written on the assumption I was still in Königsbruck, and not, in fact, already near Dresden? In any event, my lot has already been cast. I am standing beneath the palisades of Dresden. My first attempt was unsuccessful because the negotiations were conducted with Chechensky, who was commanding only 150 Cossacks. But here I am with a party of 500, of which the enemy either knows already or will soon discover. Moreover, there are the fires, which would even have fooled me had I not known who lit them and kept them going. During the course of the day, Orlov may come to join me, or at least send me help. Prendel is also nearby. All this may brighten the prospects, and God willing, everything will turn out all right. Besides, only the most obedient sergeant major would, in my place, decide to carry out Lanskoy's orders quite literally and sanction a retreat under enemy fire at the cost of his honor. If these orders had arrived before the beginning of the negotiations, it would have been an entirely different matter. Chechensky's foray could have been regarded as a typical Cossack reconnaissance and nothing more. But a demand for the city's surrender had already been made. Threats in the event of a delayed response had been expressed, and the enemy had clearly observed the bivouac fires before the city gates, dispersed over the hills to prove to them that they were not just dealing with a couple of hundred Cossacks. That's how I reasoned with myself. Incontrovertible arguments, but alas, short-sighted and lacking in depth. How is it that I couldn't get it through my head that it was not just a matter of collecting boats and gathering food supplies for the troops, not just about giving protective cover to the corps while it was moving to Gösverde, but actually a decision to remove both me and Lanskoy from the area along which Vinzingerode was planning to march on Dresden? That is what this man was demanding of me through the good offices of Lanskoy, who, like me, did not comprehend the implications of the order and innocently transmitted it, counting upon my sweet disposition, and proceeded from Bautzen to Kamenz, while I remained where I was, convinced that I was being useful and still unable to see how dangerous the consequences would be for me. As soon as it was daylight, I again sent Lowenstern as a messenger under a flag of truce to demand the surrender of the city, and announced that I had arrived with cavalry and infantry, whose fires could be seen on the hills, which signaled the impending start of an assault in case of their refusal. The reply came that General Durut wanted to talk to a staff officer empowered by me. I sent him Lieutenant Colonel Krapovitsky of the Volhynia Ulan Regiment, and to make him look more important, I added to his many medals some of my own decorations. Duruta was stationed in the old city. During the crossing of the Elbe by boat, Krapovitsky had his eyes blindfolded with a handkerchief, as is customary. A print depicting this trip by Krapovitsky was offered for sale in Dresden by some local speculator. He was led by the arm to the quarters of the French general, and the negotiations began. The Saxon General Lecoq and the members of the immediate commission were allowed to attend. By Duruta's side was his first adjutant, Captain Frank. In the meantime, what I was expecting did actually take place. Orlov, occupied by preparations for the crossing of the Elbe, could not spare his whole detachment, but sent me instead 100 Cossacks from Melentiev's regiment, and Prendel's detachment appeared on the Bautzen road. Despite the arrival of these troops, however, the negotiations, with their inevitable discussions, and sometimes becoming quite aggressive and vindictive on both sides, lasted the whole day. It was only at 9 o'clock at night that the delegates ratified the conditions in the names of Durut and myself. One of the difficulties arose from my intention to strike out certain paragraphs, which I considered totally unnecessary. Namely, the paragraph dealing with the provisioning and quartering of my troops, which called on me, through my representative, to arrange to have civil servants designated by the town authorities. The paragraph stipulating that the inhabitants should not be harmed. The paragraph mentioning the protection and preservation of the king's property, as well as his private domains, and setting up guards to protect the cadet corps building, the royal library, and the Japanese palace, all routine duties which could be carried out automatically by any commander with the least sense who might come to occupy a city. For his part, Durut, while agreeing to the surrender of the new city, did not accede to my demand that before leaving it to move to the old city, the troops defending the fortifications should give a salute to the Russians, standing at attention in parade fashion, with a guard of honor beating the drums. These difficulties occasioned a tussle and evaporated only by evening. I let the requested paragraphs stand in the articles of capitulation, but wrote under them unnecessary articles, and Durut agreed to order his troops to salute my men, as long as this was not mentioned in the articles being signed. I was satisfied because I wanted the people of Dresden to see for themselves, and not through the newspapers, that the French had been humbled before the Russians. There remained one article, however, that brought down on my head all the vultures and scavengers who haunt the resting place of past events. They reproached me for agreeing to the article which called for the cessation of hostilities in the new city itself to a distance of a 1-mile radius. In truth, this agreement on my part would have been objectionable, even unforgivable, had it not been spelled out that each one of the parties to the agreement was obligated to notify the other of the likely resumption of hostilities in this area 48 hours beforehand. And here was my thinking as to our position in relation to this clause. Without boat transport, which was concentrated on the enemy side of the river and in their hands, and taking into account the weakness of my party's composition, I could not undertake any attack against Durut, who was occupying the old city of Dresden with infantry and artillery. He, on the contrary, with the troops and boats at his disposal, could always launch an attack on me in the new city, and make me regret having dared to come out and challenge him with my Cossack command alone. Therefore, as far as my party and myself were concerned, this article protecting us from an attack by Durute was not only valuable but vital. And to this day, I cannot understand his madness in believing that the same article safeguarded him from the crossing of the Elbe by our troops, as if we necessarily had to cross the river at Dresden and could not do the same 8, 15, or 20 miles farther up or downstream. Well and good. But did I have the right to conclude this agreement only because it was beneficial to ourselves? Was I conducting this war alone against Napoleon? I was a minuscule part of the enormous combined forces. How could I presume to oblige this giant army to observe an agreement advantageous to me, but possibly harmful to the designs of the High Command and the common good? That concludes the 18th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.